Brilliant Women is meant to focus on the issue, meaning the journal issue, the newspaper issue, whatever. And as you can see from the pamphlet or the whatever it's called.
Program.
Thanks. That Sarah's the executive editor of Art News.
Actually, editor-in-chief, but
editor
who cares?
Even better. Even better.
We have 2 executive editors.
Yeah. And Jillian is the senior editor of Hyperallergic, the very well-known blog that I'm sure you all know. So what we want to do is talk about today what sort of strategies can those who are in the art criticism and art journalism field employ to institute change? What can they do as editors and as writers to really push this dialogue further? And in what ways can they do that? And I wanted to turn to Sarah first because we worked on this June Art News issue. And I was hoping you could just sort of share with everyone sort of how that came about, because I think that it's really exemplary of your dedication to feminism and to trying to really bring these issues to the fore.
Well, it's interesting because first of all, I want to start with, surely all of you noticed that when Maura was talking earlier and she mentioned a statistic that in fact is in her essay in the June Art News. She said in the December Art News there were, 33 reviews of male artists and what was it?
9.
9 of women. Anyhow, so it looks like we're a terribly sexist publication. But in fact, Art News published Linda Nochlин's essay, Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists in 1971. And then, I'm getting a little ahead of myself because I'm going to tell this story in a different way, but the magazine actually then, so 1971, we did a special issue, which actually I can just show you the cover of right here, because I made a little copy of it. We did a cover, and it was her essay with then some other kind of critical essays and that were also related to the issue, one by Betsy Baker, who was then went on to be the editor of Art in America for something like 30 years,
yeah.
And a couple more critics and scholars. And then there were a number of artist responses by people like Eleanor Anton, Louise Nevelson, responses to Linda Nochlин's provocative question, and attempt to answer that question. Then Art News then followed up that issue with an issue in 1980, an extensive look, another whole feature well, if you will, devoted to this same issue, but checking in and saying, okay, in this decade of the 1970s, the great decade of the second wave of feminism, what kind of progress had women artists and women in the art world made? The magazine checked in again in 1997, another issue devoted to women in the art world. Checked in again in 2007, which was somewhat less extensive, but still a cover story, and that, if you remember, was around the time of Global Feminism, which you were responsible for, and WAC, the 2 exhibitions devoted to feminist art. So, and also the Sackler Center, of course.
Yeah.
And so there was this history, but in fact, and I think this is an important thing when you're talking about, feminism, it's always a personal story. And I think that's such an important part of the movement is these personal stories. So I want to tell a very small, because we don't have that much time, personal story about when Maura contacted me, because I was on maternity leave with my first child, and I'd had her like maybe a month before, so this was in October. And I'd said to myself, you know what, I'm taking a real leave. I'm not going to check any messages. I'm not going to check email. That lasted 1 day. I think I checked email in the hospital. My husband's here. He can probably attest that. So anyhow, in October, but I was checking and kind of ignoring, and I had this real ambivalence, and it was, I'm sure a lot of you have been there. And then I saw this email from Maura, and she said, Jerry Saltz had suggested to get in touch with me because she thought it was time to do an issue like this again. And I thought, what a great idea. But it was because I was going through this thing that actually, I ended up looking back at all the issues we had done, and in the 1997 issue, there's an opening essay and by Kay Larson, and she mentions, in 1997, Harvard Business Review offered a summary of a study by a gender equity consultant. So it was 325 professional women, and nearly 75 of the respondents concurred with the statement, quote, once a woman has a child, she is automatically perceived to be less committed to her career, end quote. So that was quoted in 1997 Art News, which isn't that long ago. But of course, then you flash forward to, 2014, and here I am, like, thinking things like this. And of course, in anticipation of having my child, I had taken this job at Art News when I was 7 months pregnant in a kind of spirit of overcompensation against that statement. Well, okay, and if you think about Lean In, which I'm sure a lot of you have read, her big thing, don't leave before you leave. Well, I was like, I'm not just gonna not leave before I leave, I'm gonna do something bigger and leave and then come back. And then, so these questions were, and it's ended up, being much more complicated even than I anticipated. But these questions were very much on my mind, and I thought, and then I started looking at the history of Art News' engagement with this, and I thought, I mentioned, and I don't want to go on and on because we don't have that much time, but I just want to say quickly, like, the last time we had done an issue like this, in 2007, like I said, the features were very much about these global feminism, WAC, these feminist exhibitions that were happening around 2007, Sackler Center. But what was missing in the 2007, that was in the 97, that was in 1980, that was in 1971, was the artists' voices. And I thought, you know what, let's go back to that. And I just want to say, that it turned out to be such, I think, a great idea. Because we had, like, artists really just telling their stories and saying, and reacting in the same way, structured the same way we did with Linda Nochlins, essay being this, they all read Maura's piece, which she kind of outlined a bit for you just now. And they said, okay, here's kind of how my story intersects with some of this, and let's take, the quantitative and make it qualitative. And it just, I thought, was such a great way of approaching it, to go back to that original thing of these women artists telling their stories. And I just want to add, the other day, I went to the Phillips collection, and maybe some of you have seen, they have the Question Project, which is, African-American, about African-American men. And these two artists decided to, since 2008, they've been, going to men, African-American men, and saying, ask us a question, and then answer some of these other questions that these other men have provided, and they made these videos. And I sat down and watched this, and it was, there's so many articles out there right now about, obviously Black Lives Matter, and this is a huge issue, and I read all of this, and I feel like this, this is something that, like, a question we all have to address. But it wasn't until I sat down and I watched those, and everyone should go there and watch it. And I felt like I really get it. Some of these questions were just so intense and personal and sad and funny, and, like, I really got it. I felt like that's what it's like, and I think, like, that's the important thing, like, is to always come back to the roots of second wave feminists, of telling those stories, and that's what it's like. And so, anyhow, that's the long story of how, like, this issue came about.
And we had Cindy Sherman respond.
And we had all kinds of different artists, which we can go into some, maybe a little further on. I can tell you some of their responses that I thought were interesting. But if you want to move on, we can move on.
Let's turn to Jillian, and then I think we'll come back around, actually, to what you've been mentioning. Jillian, I know that you're a huge supporter of feminist issues, and you've done many articles that I think illuminate that. And I'd love for you to talk a little bit about how that intersects with your role as a senior editor. Like, how can you, again, coming back to that question, how can you as an editor institute change within this important, kind of platform?
Mm-hmm. So this is something that I think about a lot. I think that it breaks down into sort of many different areas. So I'm the senior editor at Hyperallergic, but that means that I also write. So I'm both a writer and an editor. So on the writing side, I write a lot of things that are feminist, whether super explicitly or just more subtly. I mostly write about what I'm interested in, but that mostly often just ends up being feminist a lot of the time. So that's one way, is sort of like covering women's shows or covering women's issues, or just sort of doing the thing where you were talking in your introduction about calling out. I feel like that's a really important strategy that I've employed a lot. Mostly because I don't feel like it happens anywhere else in the art press online, and then I sort of have these moments where I'm like, am I taking crazy pills? Like, why is no one saying anything? And then I write something. That's usually how it goes. And then as an editor, I think there are a number of things that I can do, and I'm working to do them all better. One is, you know, assigning pieces about women and commissioning pieces about women and accepting pitches that are about women artists. You know, our schedule's really hectic. We don't plan issues the way like Art News does because we're a daily publication. So I'm not always planning ahead as much as I would like, and often I'm sort of just taking what comes in. But I'm trying to keep an eye and, you know, part of my brain focused on that and making sure. And then, you know, also like not just writing about women, but writing by women. So I'm looking for women writers. And this also applies to writers of color and, you know, the same issues there. You know, and again, not just accepting them when they come to me and pitch me things, but if I meet them, encouraging them to pitch me. You know, trying to nurture the ones who are good and or have potential to pitch me more. This is like not, you know, I don't think there have been formal studies about this, but from anecdotal evidence, I've found that like women, and I was like this myself when I was a freelancer, women are much less likely to pitch you again if you turn down their first pitch. And they're much less persistent. A man will just pitch you until you accept finally, which is great, but women take it really personally and then they don't send you again. So I think about the way I respond to people and I encourage them to write me again and to send me ideas because I want more women writers. And yeah, just sort of nurturing them in terms of their careers, not just sort of one-off pieces here and there.
Yeah, and you've also been incredibly open to ideas, at least that I pitched, which I appreciated. I went to see the Venice Biennale and I asked Jillian if I could review it, but review only the women artists in the Venice Biennale. But we wouldn't say that it was a feminist review or that it was only women artists. She was like, absolutely. So I reviewed it and they were like, you know, covered the entire Biennale, but only talked about women artists. So
and I think
Jillian was like, yeah, no worries.
And I think everyone just sort of, I sort of like it when there are those politics that are more under, yeah. I have one writer actually, a woman, who only reviews shows by women. She will only review women's work. And it's not something we've ever explicitly talked about. It's not like she's proclaimed it. It's just, that's what she does. And again, and it is just sort of this, you know, this little politics where like she'll only cover women's solo shows and that's great. I love it.
But it's interesting what you said earlier, and when you talk, like, coming back to like the idea of like, can there be parity, you know? Right. When you're talking about how women and pitching you and how they won't follow up on a pitch, I mean, this comes back actually to something that was in our issue that we did together, which is one of the artists' respondents was actually a group of, it was a bit of a departure, as was the Guerrilla Girls, obviously, but this was a group of women curators called Cleopatras, that they have a gallery, and, you know, they were sort of saying, oh, you know, because it's 3 women, people sometimes assume we have a program of all women. In fact, we don't, you know, and now we're looking at our percentages. They're pretty good, they could be better. But then they said at the end, they said, what we do notice is that we get approached, you know, by a lot of male artists, and we call them the squeaky wheels. And they'll keep coming back to us and say, do a show of me, you know, do a show of me, like, yeah. Support my work. Yeah. And she said, women need to be more of squeaky wheels, and it's the same thing you're saying with writers.
I think women don't self-promote as much. I think there's this sort of fear that you'll be annoying, and I think it's really subconscious, but I think women are really conditioned to just, oh, sorry to bug you. I know you hate me because you didn't respond to my email, but... Which is something I do, and then I consciously stop myself, and I'm like, wait, no, that's crazy.
Well, like you say, I mean, we're conditioned to be that way. I mean, women historically have been conditioned to be silent and to be passive. I mean, as much as we think we've moved beyond that, it's still something we struggle with, I think. And
it's a question of thinking your ideas are really good.
Yeah. But speaking of calling out, I was hoping that you could sort of give a broad or a short overview, I guess, of your open letter to a museum here in DC protesting the Bill Cosby exhibition.
Yeah, so I wrote a letter to the director of the National Museum of African Art here in DC. There's
on the blog, though, so it was...
Yeah, so the exhibition that's up right now, you can all go see it if you haven't. I suppose I recommend it. I don't know. It's an exhibition of work by Bill and Camille Cosby's collection alongside work from the museum's collection. It's called Conversations. It's complicated. So I was not the only one to write about it. I want to say that Philip Kennicott and Kristen Capps, both men, wrote really good pieces about it, which I really appreciated. I hadn't seen it until yesterday, but I had read a lot about it. The Cosbys paid for the show, which was one of my biggest problems with it. Also, there's a bunch of work in there that isn't just from their collection, but concerns them personally. And so when the New York Magazine piece came out about, that had the testimonials from like these dozens of women who say they've been abused by Bill Cosby, I read that piece and I was like hysterically crying. I mean, it's awful. And I felt like I had to write something. I had already written something about the exhibition, but I felt like I had to write something more forceful. And I think, there's this idea that really bugs me, that art and museums sort of exist separate from the rest of the world. And so the whole response from the museum has been, it's about the artists, it's about the artists. And yeah, it is about the artists, sort of. But when you're letting a collector buy a show at your institution, essentially, you're valuing that person and their collection. And I did see the show yesterday, and I had read some of the text in advance. And the text is there's quotes from him, there's discussions of how they really value family, which is extremely cruelly ironic given all the circumstances. I don't know, I felt a need to sort of pick at that and say that, like, we can't just pretend that the museum is this sacred structure that exists separately and outside of what's going on in the rest of the world, because I think, like we were saying, like, women are not going to have parity in the arts if they don't have parity in the rest of life. And that show, I think, is really exemplary of that.
But what was interesting about that piece you wrote was you were kind of saying, like, okay, you've done it, you've committed to this show, the show will go on, like, yeah. But what I can't remember is, was there, like, in other words, what could they do? Like, okay, they've committed to the show's going up, but like, could the museum put something in the wall or display text? I don't know.
They did. A solution? So interesting. The letter was partly me grappling with the question of what the solution would be. Yeah. Because Philip and Kristen had written that they thought they should take the show down. Now, having seen the show, I also think they should take it down. But I hadn't seen it yet, so I didn't feel comfortable saying that. But so interestingly, after Kristen, Philip, and I all wrote these pieces, they did add text at the beginning. And the text says, we recognize that there are these allegations and we don't condone this alleged behavior, but the show is about more than that, whatever. I think the show is actually not really about more than that. There will be more writing on this topic forthcoming, but I have major problems with the show, and I think that that's sort of a lie at this point.
And I think the reason why I wanted you to bring up this story is I think as a writer and as an editor, and you have this incredible platform, you're calling out institutions. And I think that there are so few writers that do that, and they won't take the risk. And so that's why I just really admire that you did that, and I know you'll continue to do it.
Thank you. I think it's tricky, too. I was saying to you just quickly, like, I think part of the reason I think we have to call out institutions is because I think that's one of the only things we can do. I can send people to women's shows, I can review women's shows, but I can't make people put on more women's shows, I can't make MoMA mount a year of solo shows of women. I would love to, but I don't have that power. So I think in some ways, yeah, I feel like, reviewing isn't enough. It's great, but I think there needs to be stuff that's more active.
Yeah. Well, that's why I think doing major issues with like a major publication like Art News are so important.
Yeah.
Because their distribution is so widespread, and it's like across the world, and it's like someone might not even be concerned or interested in women's issues, but they're going to get that issue in their mailbox. Right. So it has this kind of potential to be really transformative in that way.
Right, and just to sort of keep the conversation going is the way I was thinking about it. Because actually, Jillian, I have to bring up, because I thought it was so interesting, and you'll probably not be happy with this, but in your recent podcast interview with Tyler Green, you sort of said, do we need another panel? Which I think is a totally legitimate question, referring to even to the panel, what we're all doing here today. And I was thinking about that because I asked the same question. In fact, it's in my editor's letter to this issue. It's like, do we need another women's issue?
Right.
But I thought, you know what? Worst case scenario, and in fact, in the editor's letter, I quoted, you know, a colleague of mine that I ran into at a party. I said, oh, we're doing a women's issue. She's like, why don't you do a men's issue? She's like, there's been enough of that. Like, why do we need to do that again? It's like, oh, another women's issue. But I thought, like, worst case scenario, the thing comes out and it's like, hey, everything's great. Let's take a victory lap. And I was like, I'd still publish that.
Yeah, totally.
Like, you know, like a memorial to all the progress we've made and everything's perfect now. And, you know, and then at the end be like, this marks the end of all women's issues. We're calling a moratorium, so goodbye. But here's a nice send-off, 128 pages, goodbye. You know, like, I would do that.
Yeah.
So I thought in the worst case, let's do that.
Totally.
You know?
I mean, I think part of what I was trying to get at is just the question of like, how I think conversations are really important, but the question of how we move beyond conversations to action. And, you know, that's why we're talking about strategies and what we can do. But I think sometimes, you know, you can have panels and you can have discussions and you can bring women together, but that's not enough, as we've learned over decades. I mean, there needs to be more somehow, whatever that is.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if you had more questions, but there's something I wanted to mention also that came out of Jillian, when you were talking on Tyler Green's podcast, and you were talking about the relationship of the market and museums, you were sort of saying, like, in the past, you didn't want to see that there was as much of a relationship. And I really thought about that because I thought, I was thinking about, like, the history of these, you know, women's issues we did with Art News and the years that they came out. And then I was thinking about Deb Cass's response in the current one. And she tells this story about in the 70s, like she said there were these group of women painters and they were like doing interesting things and they had a kind of prominence. And then in the 80s, the conversation about art generally really shifted to the market. And I think, and like maybe Gabby can speak a bit to that when she's talking, but I think the conversation is still there.
Yeah.
Like from the 80s to now, it's a continuum.
Yeah.
Forget recessions. Like it survived a terrible recession and then it survived a sort of blip one. We have to wrap up soon, but what I wanted to say is like there's a correlation. Like, you know, when you look at 1971, we did the issue, 1980, we did the issue. That was before kind of this, the 80 was the beginning of the market stuff. And then you see it in the 97 one, people are talking more about the market. And just quickly, like when I was thinking, before we went to do this panel, I talked to this collector in England who's doing this work with the Sculpture Center now to bring women artists there. And she told me this whole like really connecting these things and about how if, like, for women to enter into the market, for the collectors to get interested in the work, and for those prices to come into parity, well, they need to get into the museums. But it's all connected because the museums need to get the audience, and the museums need to please the trustees, so they end up with the same male artists that please the audiences, that please the trustees, and the galleries are supporting the museum exhibitions. And you saw the Julia Halpern piece in the art newspaper, 5 galleries. Their artists in like something like 80% of the museum exhibitions, you know, here and in the UK. And so if it's 5 galleries, you look at those galleries rosters, it's all like the male-centric, and it's going to be their male artists. So it's all it's all this circle, and it's, you know,
scarily symbiotic.
So somewhere in there, someone has to come in, and it's going to be like these women trustees, like Barbara Lee, like this person, like you know, exactly. So anyhow, we're running out of time.
They just told us we have to stop.
Oh my God. So are we running out of time? Oh, stop.
We're out of time. We have to stop now.
There's a big stop sign,
We have
literally.
so much more to say, and we just got going.
But we'll talk at the dinner party.
All right, thanks.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much.